In the late 14th century, the Yuan dynasty in China began to crumble as the agriculture and economy collapsed, partly by overtaxation, inflation, and massive flooding of the Yellow River. Out of a host of rebellions, one rebel leader rose to prominence, Zhu Yuanzhang. He first captured Nanjing and made it his capital, building a 48-kilometre wall around the city. After a war between the son and the grandson of Zhu, during which the palace of Nanjing was burnt to the ground, the successful son became the Yongle Emperor in 1402 and began building a new capital in Beijing. At the centre of this new city was the Forbidden City, the emperor's palatial residence. Work started on it in 1406 and continued for the next 14 years. The palace takes the form of a city, with nearly 1,000 buildings built along an axis of about 1 kilometre in length. For 500 years it housed the Chinese emperors. One could only go in or out of the Forbidden City with the permission of the emperor, and for most Chinese, entry was strictly forbidden. The Chinese emperors lived in their own world, separated from the population, surrounded by walls nearly 8 metres high and a moat 6 metres deep. Today, millions of people walk through the entrance and into the huge outer court. They cross the artificial stream, the Golden Water River, make their way to the largest of the buildings, the Hall of Supreme Harmony. It was used for special occasions during the Ming Dynasty, a place for the emperor to discuss the affairs of state with his advisors. They walk through the rooms of the courtiers, now museums for the palace's priceless treasures. Behind the Hall of Supreme Harmony is the inner court. This was the home of the emperor and his family. The emperor lived in the largest of the buildings here, the Palace of Heavenly Purity. The empress had her home in the Palace of Early Tranquility. And between them was the Hall of Union. Other members of the royal family, consorts and concubines, lived in smaller rooms to the side of the main axis.
Maybe he's not a good ruler, and he's a good man.
Beyond the buildings was the imperial garden. Beyond the gate is the Jingshan Imperial Park, a hill built from the earth from the moat. Again, it was a place for the emperor and his guests alone. Now it is enjoyed by all the members of the public. Much of the life of the emperor revolved around some special ceremonies. There was the annual visit to the Temple of Heaven, where the emperor would pray for good harvests for the coming year. Then there were the regular visits to the Ming family tombs, where the emperor would pay homage to his ancestors. The site for these tombs was selected in 1420, in a valley about 50 kilometres from Beijing, where mountains would deflect evil spirits coming from the north. Over the next 200 years, 13 Ming emperors were buried here, along with some members of their families. Most of the burial tombs are hidden in great mounds of earth, so that no one would know exactly where they were. Most have not been excavated. The emperor would proceed through gateways and halls, finally arriving at the place before the Soul Tower where offerings would be made. One of the major constructions of the Ming dynasty was the Great Wall of China. This was never one wall, but walls were constructed particularly to keep out invaders from Mongolia over a period of 1800 years or more. The Mutianyu section is just 70 kilometers from Beijing and was rebuilt on the site of a 6th century wall in 1569. It was restored in 1983 and opened to tourists in 1986. It was built of great granite boulders, up to 8.5 meters high and with a width of 4 to 5 meters at the top. While it must have been a huge and horrific task to build, it would be easy for soldiers to move quickly along the wall from one watchtower to the next. It is indicative of the great fear that the Chinese had for the barbarians who lived beyond these mountains to the north. While attacks from Mongolia did occur, the longer-term threat was the Europeans, who came to the shores of China in boats. The Portuguese tried to establish trade with China in the early 16th century, but were driven away, until 1557, when they were allowed to establish a trading place on Macau. The Jesuits initiated mission work in China in 1582 and established themselves in Beijing. The Italian priest Matteo Ricci introduced Western science, mathematics and visual arts to the Chinese scholars. The Ming scholars had built an astronomic observatory on the city wall. In 1644, a Belgian Jesuit, Fernandez Verbiest, brought a range of more accurate European instruments to help with the observations. The Jesuits worked closely with the Chinese scholars such as Zhu Gongqi, sharing the knowledge of astronomy. The Catholic missionaries built several churches in Beijing. One of the oldest is St. Joseph's Church, originally constructed in 1655. The original church was destroyed by an earthquake and then rebuilt. It was burnt down again in 1990 and has since been rebuilt in the same style. In the city of Beijing, many people lived in houses built around courtyards, known as hutongs. Some of these remain, and we visited some. The houses are quite small and built around a maze of small lanes. Houses did not have their own washrooms. There were public washrooms serving a number of houses. The hours were sounded from huge towers. A bell tower to mark the hours during the day, and a drum tower to mark the hours during the night. These towers were used throughout the Ming and Qing dynasties and were only silenced in the early 20th century. Out from Shanghai, however, some towns were built on the water, and people used boats to move around the town, to go to their places of work and to buy goods. We took a tour around one such town, Zhujiajiao, a town which has a history of 1,700 years. It came to its peak in the Qing dynasty as a major centre for rice and clothing production. While it has become today a major tourist centre, there's still some sense of the design of the old town. We enjoyed a walk through the town, followed by a boat trip. The wealthy created beautiful gardens, such as the Yuyang Garden or Garden of Happiness in Shanghai. It was first constructed in 1589 by Pan Yanduan for his father in his old age. It was most recently renovated between 1956 and 1961 after destruction from the Japanese. As the paths wind in and out of rocks and ponds, tea houses and trees, so there are constantly changing vistas, each delightful in its own right. People shopped in streets such as Furong Street in Jinan. This street has a very long history, although much of its present form can be traced to the 1660s. It was the administrative, financial, commercial and cultural centre of Jinan. Today it's a very pleasant mall, mostly lined with food shops. Beyond it, and close to Daming Lake, is a museum which portrays what life used to be like in the city. Processing soybeans, washing clothes by hand, carrying wooden pails, drinking tea. The town of Pingyao preserves much of the feel of a Ming Dynasty town, with its lanes and shops. The walls were built in 1370 and still completely surround the old town. You can walk right around the town on the walls, which are about 12 metres high. There are just 6 gates into the city. Within the city, many of the shops and residences retain the appearance they had when they were constructed in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's little room for traffic in the old city, and most of the major roads are for walking only. Today it's a major tourist centre, and the shops are open at night as tourists, mostly Chinese people, walk the colourful streets. Pingyao had a special function as a major stop on the trading route from Xi'an to Beijing. Thus, one of the enterprising residents of Pingyao began building a bank, which was opened in 1823. This was known as the Rishengchang and was the first Chinese draft bank. Rather than traders having to carry large amounts of cash across China, the bank issued drafts, which could be cashed in at any of the bank's branches in different parts of China. In Pingyao itself, deep vaults held the silver reserves to back the drafts they issued. By the end of the 19th century, there were 475 branches in China and some in other countries such as Russia. The bank finally closed its doors in the Great Depression in 1932. While China was very self-sufficient and considered itself to be the cultural centre of the world, the European nations were eager to open China up to trade. Britain was particularly keen to trade tea, silk and porcelain. Britain began to pay for its goods with opium, which it grew in India, and the Chinese use of opium increased, with many becoming addicted. The government banned opium in 1799. But when shipments of opium were thrown overboard by the Chinese, the British declared war. The resulting Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced the Chinese to open 4 ports to trade, in addition to Guangzhou, and conceded Hong Kong to the British. Further pressure was put on the Chinese to improve their trade, not just by Britain but also by France and other countries. As a result, concessions, or areas where the foreign powers could open banks and other offices for organising their trade, were opened up in Shanghai, for example. The Bund was an area in which the foreign powers built such buildings alongside the Huangpu River. The French concession in Shanghai includes a whole suburb of French-style buildings. While some are homes, they also include restaurants, cafes and hotels. There's also a French-style park. The largest and most dominant concession was Hong Kong, which remained in British hands until 1999, and which retains a different status from the rest of China today. It still houses many international companies. It's a major centre for trade between China and the rest of the world. As the 19th century drew to a close, there was anger at these concessions. However, the Chinese had glimpsed a different world and way of life. Heavily taxed and oppressed, many became increasingly restless for a revolution which would modernize the empire.